international relations are, how many of you have had the chance of debating motions that are about relations between countries, about wars, about this sort of stuff? Okay, so it does come up often in tournaments where you have motions like about sanctions on North Korea, or about the Syrian civil war, or about relations between different countries in the Balkans, things like that. And the reason these motions are really complex is that they have just a lot of different actors acting in them. If you think about it, like, let's say you have a debate about economics. In that debate, you have people who are buying and selling stuff. You have the national economy. You have factories. You have many different actors that operate. In an international relations debate, you basically have economics as part of it, because all these economic actors are involved if there is a war or if there is trade between countries and so on. But also, you have national governments. And everything we talk about in debate usually is about what governments do and how they make decisions. So all these different government processes are also part of international relations debates. In the same way, individual people, leaders, psychology of leaders, all these things can be analyzed and are important to understand what's going on when we're talking about international realities. And I think on the one hand, that makes these debates very complex, because you have to understand how a very, very complicated system works between countries, what makes relations between countries go the way they do. On the other hand, the useful thing about that is if you think about these things fully, you will never run out of extensions in an international relations debate. Because you can always analyze more actors. You can always analyze more different stakeholders that are involved. Like, even if so let's take a motion. Let's say we have a motion on this house would lift sanctions from North Korea. So North Korea, a pretty crazy country in Northeast Asia, developing nuclear weapons, being very oppressive to its own population, quite belligerent or hostile to the rest of the world, and currently it's under very harsh sanctions by almost everyone except China. And let's say you get this motion, this house would lift sanctions from North Korea. So could you just try and give me arguments you would make for this motion? Why do we want to not have sanctions on North Korea?
Not have sanctions anymore.
Yeah, currently we have sanctions. And the idea is lifting those sanctions. Abolishing them, yeah.
Maybe as a show of good faith to improve relations.
Okay, good faith to improve relations, great. Additional ideas. Why would it be good to not have sanctions on North Korea?
Because of these sanctions, North Korea can develop further into a step like that with the oppressive regime.
Great. So two things here actually. One is North Korea will just be better off, like development and so on, without the sanctions. And two, when they develop, it's also more likely for the regime to change.
Yes, because I would like to extend it.
Sure.
To say that removing these sanctions, we are going to remove that image that they have as a country, and it will open maybe new investors to come, and people like tourists will come more to that.
Yes,
country.
great. People will come, and why is this good?
It's going to improve their quality of life, and they will have more profit from it.
Okay, yeah, they'll have more profit, definitely. Additional things? So try to think in different directions. Try to think of what this means for different actors within the country, within other countries. So, for example, who are the sanctions currently hurting? If you have sanctions on countries, it's very, very oppressive. Does it hurt the regime, or does it hurt the average person on the street?
It hurts
Average person, right? So these people, so literally you're making people starve right now in North Korea because of these sanctions. And like the leaders of the country keep having quite a good life. So is this something that's even moral to do? Because you're basically attacking or punishing civilian population. It has nothing to do with the regime itself. Other things? So we mentioned already that this is something that could lead to good faith with this country. Tell me more on that. How is it likely that removing sanctions changes this country's behavior for the better? Like, why does it make North Korea a better actor?
Because the people won't see the West as their enemy anymore.
Excellent, excellent. Right now what's happening is people, like the regime is telling the people, the US, Europe and so on are your enemy. And look, they are sanctioning us. They are the ones stopping you from having food. So that's one thing. But also what happens when tourists do come in and when businesses open and when the economy develops? Yes?
They see how the West actually is and get an idea of how life outside North Korea is.
Yes. So individual people are exposed to norms of freedom, of democracy, of free economy, all these different things. So there is more of a chance of them demanding things from our government. That's one thing. But also, the government itself, or the economy, becomes more dependent on the West. There's more connections. That means that the West also has more power then to change policies, to say, yes, we're giving you these things, but we would really love for you to, for example, scale down your nuclear program, things like that. So basically, already, I think, just thinking of this without knowing that much about North Korea, I don't think any of us are experts about this topic, we've already come up with, I think, at least 8 different arguments. That would be, if we're going back to the previous workshop for a second, if you have 8 different arguments, you will generally have an extension in debate, even if the opening team did a good job and took some of those arguments. So just the idea of having like a wide view of all the actors involved, all the different processes involved, is very, very useful. By the way, can be useful even if it's a topic you don't know that much about. And Tim.
Yeah, and I think that the last thing that Ayal said is very important. Very often you can make arguments in international relations debates even if you don't know much about the motion. And again, if you go back to the previous workshop, the points I gave you how to analyze incentives, like what do actors want, how far they're willing to go to get it, is perfectly applicable in IR debates because states have interests, governments have interests, they can be analyzed in this kind of way. So the primary advice I have for you when you get an IR motion is, don't panic just because it's IR. You can make general presumptions, you can make general conclusions, and probably other teams in the room are also equally scared of the IR motion as you are. And even if they know a lot, this can also be a detriment to them. Because very often teams who know a lot about the motion are very opinionated about it, and they think that one argument is necessarily the winning argument. And then they neglect all the potential clashes that you can see within a certain motion. So I think that's what's very important. I think in other cases, what would be a good advice for you guys to prep for IR debates is try to keep track of what the primary interests and what the primary policy goals of certain countries at a specific moment in time are. As in, relevant countries in the world, like the European Union, it's not a country, but relevant actor. United States of America, China, Russia, Iran, Israel, generally the Middle East, so Iraq, Syria. Because even if you don't know a lot, knowing certain general presumptions about countries and general knowledge can help you derive arguments. So currently, we know that the United States of America, Trump's primary points of foreign policy are less American interventionism in the Middle East, pursuing closer ties with Russia, and simultaneously he being in a trade war with Europe and China, so imposing tariffs on one another. This is a very useful context to know when you're debating. Context about Russia, for example, would be Russia is currently under sanctions. There's the unresolved issue of Ukraine, and Putin is in a dilemma because on the one hand, he is building a lot of legitimacy on the idea of saving the Russian people in Ukraine, but on the other hand, he's being sanctioned because of it, so what do? We know that China is currently hugely investing in Southeastern Asia and the wider region, the Caucasus, because of the Belt and Road Initiative, and they want to create trading deals. We know that Iran is currently being sanctioned because of its nuclear program again. Those are general things which you can read from news headlines and that can really help you make arguments. So my advice for you would be try to follow general trends. You don't have to have specific knowledge, but try to follow general trends. What are the primary points of a foreign policy of a country? What is a country or an actor trying to do at a certain point, and how likely they are to be able to achieve? I think that would be some advice for prepping for your debates. Do you have anything else you would add for like prepping for tournaments?
No, I think that's a very useful tip and thing to bear in mind. One thing I would say additionally is try and think of analogies. Try to think how something if you get a motion that you don't know much about, or a situation in the world that you don't know much about, try and think of equivalent things from situations you do know about. So, for example, if there is if you're talking about a civil war happening somewhere in the world, ethnically based, you're in a region that had ethnic-based civil wars, so you have some intuitions on how these things work out, even if your context might be slightly different, right? So sometimes just taking examples, here's what happened in the Balkans, and here is why this could be relevant for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or for Sri Lanka, or whatever. There's this famous example, like legacy story in the Israeli-based circuit, where a team was speaking in Worlds. They were in their first year, I think, and they get this motion with no info slide. This house would not allow either Sri Lankan generals or members of the Tamil Tigers to run for parliament in Sri Lanka. And they look at the motion, they look at each other, and they go, I know there is a country named Sri Lanka. It sounds unreasonable to me that tigers will be in parliament, but besides that, I know nothing. And they're OG. They're supposed to introduce the topic, so they look at the motion again, they go, what can we understand from this? First of all, there are generals, and there's this rebel organization. So probably there was some civil war happening between these groups. The civil war probably ended, because otherwise we wouldn't be talking about an election, or about them running for election. So basically, we're in the aftermath of a war, and the question is, should the people who fought this war be allowed to run for parliament? Okay, this is something we can work with, we can make, and then they took lots of analogies from what happens with the Palestinian Liberation Movement and terrorist organizations, and whether they should be allowed to run for parliament or not. And they ended up taking second in the room, because they had the right logic, they had the right intuitions about what's going on. The one team that beat them for knowing significantly more about Sri Lanka, but fair enough. In this case, you probably deserve to not take it first. But still, you can do quite a lot, even with little knowledge of the motion. And with that, I think one of the most useful things to know about international relations is not the facts, but have a good conception of what makes the international system tick. What sort of things influence the behavior of states, and what states are like, what they behave like. And luckily, there is a lot of theory on that, made by the field of international relations, an academic field, which I think Tin and I both studied at different points. So what we're going to do is basically try and cram in a first-year introduction class to international relations into the next half hour. I hope this will be interesting, I hope this will be fun. Bear with us if it is not, but please ask questions, be involved, because we want to make sure that you're with us and following what we're saying. So basically, I think that a good place to start is what's called political realism. And this basically is an approach that says the following thing. So, to characterize the internet, the biggest difference between an international system and something that happens within a state is the following. Inside a state, we have what's called hierarchy. We have a government, and the government runs things and gives orders and has the authority to do all sorts of actions. And for example, if I disobey the law, then the police will come and I will be taken to a court and I will be sentenced, and certain sanctions will be applied to me depending on what crime it was that I did, right? And so if, for example, I am in the middle of the night, I hear someone trying to break into my house, I can call the police, and hopefully the police will come and arrest that person and stop him from breaking into my house. However, if, for example, I am in Ukraine and Russia has now broke into my house, invaded with its army, who do I call in the middle of the night?
No one.
Like, you can call the UN, they will have a very strong condemnation of that act. This will not help me very much. I can call my allies, if I have allies, but you know, it's up to them if they come or not. Statistical analysis says that in 70% of cases of war, allies did not come to the aid of people they have an alliance with. That is like literally how history plays out, because there's nothing forcing them to do so. So if, you know, the US was not actually willing to go to war for Ukraine, to go to war with Russia for the Ukraine. And that makes sense from a US perspective. Like, why would you risk a war with another superpower over this country that you don't have that much in common with anyway? So basically, this is in a way a state of anarchy. Now, because anarchy just in the sense of no central authority. It doesn't mean that everything is chaotic, because there are a lot of institutions, there are a lot of clear rules of the game between countries, but you don't have one central authority that says, you must do this, you must do this. And so if, for example, I was in a country, and if I was living in a country where I knew the police will not come if I call them in the middle of the night, what do I do? What's the first thing I probably do if I know the police is not going to protect me from crime?
Grab something, stick. Grab a stick.
I grab a stick.
Yeah.
Definitely, I grab a stick. If I can run, maybe I run. But if we're talking about the world, like, because this is our analogy, I'm not sure where a country can run to. So yeah, I grab a big stick. Or in other words, I develop a military force. I develop an army and make sure that this army is strong enough to defend me if I'm being attacked. What's the problem though? I'm sitting at home and I bought this big stick. Or I bought a gun. Let's even to make the analogy clearer, I bought a gun. But my neighbors, for the very same reason, also bought guns. My neighbor could potentially break into my house using that gun. So that's a big problem, right? Because even if he was doing this just to defend himself, what ends up happening is I have become less secure just because he did something for his own defense. So this is basically what's called in international relations a security dilemma. Meaning, every state trying to, let's say, every state is just trying to protect itself. That's all states care about. They just want to defend themselves, they don't want to invade anyone, they don't want to do anything hostile to anyone. The difference between having a defensive army and an offensive army is non-existent. Like, in both cases, it's people with uniform, with tanks, with guns, standing on borders. So as a country, you have to assume the worst. You have to assume that other countries could potentially invade you, and you have to build your forces accordingly. Which basically leads to one of two things. One is the scenario of an arms race. Basically, one country gets more guns, builds its army stronger. Other countries around it do the same. In that case, sometimes it will be the case that a country will feel that it's losing this arms race. It can no longer buy more weapons and more stuff. And at that point, sometimes it will make more sense for that country to go to war at this point, before it will be too weak. For example, in 1914, the assessment in Germany, in the German General Staff, was that within 3 or 4 years, Russia will complete a railroad system that will bring them closer to the border, that will allow them to transport troops to the border more quickly. And at that point, they will not be able to have a war, to sustain a war with Russia and France at the same time, which was their main concern. So therefore, their assessment and their recommendation was to their government, we should go to war now. Just because we want to defend ourselves, we have to invade other countries in order to make sure that we don't lose out in this sort of arms race. Now, and this basically, in World War I, all countries involved had solely defensive purposes when entering this war. And this led to one of the worst wars in history. So this is one scenario in which war breaks out and in which things, in which the security dilemma manifests itself. The other scenario, though, is one country being significantly, actually not developing its army, and another country being significantly stronger and saying, I can just invade this country now. Like, I will lose almost nothing and I can gain quite a lot from it. Like, if you look at Russia versus Ukraine, it's very easy for Russia to take over Ukraine because Ukraine is so much weaker. In the same way, it was quite easy for Germany in World War II to take over Poland or other countries, or Czechoslovakia or other countries like that. So, it's sort of a situation where you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? If you do develop your army, you risk an arms race. If you don't, you risk things like, you risk just being invaded. So, when I'm talking about this to people in like Western Europe, in Vienna, in England and so on, I get really incredulous looks, like people saying, what? But that doesn't happen. Like, wars don't, the international reality doesn't look like that. I think in this region of the world, it's more intuitive to you that these things may be true and that countries could behave in these ways. So I feel I've been talking for a while now. I'll let Tim continue or take it from here.
So I think the last important concept from the theory of political realism that we still have to mention is the concept of balance of powers. And I think that to a certain extent explains the problem that Ayal just raised, and that is that many people say, okay, the way that international relations theory in terms of realism says how wars break out, very often doesn't happen, wars don't break out. The reason for this is because given that everything Ayal told you points to one thing, and that is that the primary incentive of all countries, because they cannot count on anyone else, is survival. The primary incentive is to survive, and you do what you can to survive. This means that you as a country are incentivized to maintain a balance of powers in international relations. All countries have an incentive to create a system that will prevent any country from becoming a unipolar force, that will prevent any country from becoming so strong they can simply invade everyone else and take control of the world. And that is why countries are very often willing to impose certain restrictions even on themselves, if that means that the same restrictions are going to be applied to other countries and that this will prevent one country becoming too powerful. And a perfect example of this is the United Nations Security Council. So essentially, the Security Council is almost exclusively an obstructionist body. So the only thing it does, it prevents things from happening because of the veto power, because the 5 winners of World War II still have veto power. However, the reason why the United States accepts that Russia has veto power is because the United States also has veto power. You accept that you might be restricted by someone else. If you can also restrict someone else, and if you can prevent them from taking unilateral action, which might go against your interests. Another example of this, although less efficient, because some of the greatest countries in the world, like the US, have opted out of the system, is international law. Note that Ayal says there is no hierarchy in international relations and it's a state of anarchy. What this means is there are no principles that you can be forced to follow. Because international law is simply opt-in, opt-out. You sign a treaty, and this treaty binds you to an international court. For example, if you sign the Treaty of Rome, you're bound to the ICC. However, you can opt out of the ICC, you can leave it. If I'm correct, Burundi has done that, like the of course. However, the reason why countries still do accept the jurisprudence of the ICC is because they believe that by setting a precedent of doing so, other countries will follow suit, and then there will be some degree of control exercised over other countries. Another reason why countries accept restrictions on their behavior is because they want to maintain diplomatic image. I mean, Russia is part of the European Court of Human Rights. That sounds very counterintuitive. And then if I tell you that Russia has outlawed the death penalty because of a European Court of Human Rights settlement, that sounds even more counterintuitive, because why would Russia join that court? Why would Russia listen to that court? It's not even a European Union institution, it's a Council of Europe institution, like, completely useless. However, the reason why Russia still does that is because in diplomacy, and because you want to have the survival interest, when you are negotiating with other countries, you want to be able to have leverage over them. If there is a consensus, although nobody might believe this, but it is perceived to be the consensus, that as an international community we want to espouse values of liberty, human rights, yada yada, you want to be able to say, look, I made an effort towards preserving human rights. I made an effort towards achieving these common goals. Conversely, nobody wants to be portrayed as a country that is rogue in terms of like the primary principles. So, except for the United States of America, you have a big incentive as a country to follow international law. Because if you don't, you're going to be portrayed as a country which sponsors terrorism, breaks human rights, does not try to implement democracy and democratic principles. What that means is that other countries are less likely to negotiate with you, that other countries are less likely to give you deals, that other countries are more likely to say, oh, look, you're a rogue country, you do not respect principles, we do not know what you're going to do, so we have to be more harsh on you. And then it has a spillover effect. Because if I'm Croatia, I do not want to negotiate with a country who the European Union has marked as being a sponsor of terrorism. Because then that means that I'm also a sponsor of terrorism. I am negotiating with these people. I am negotiating with the people that important actors in the international community have branded as being bad actors. This means that even within the realist framework, there is quite a lot of incentives for countries to control their behavior. And very often, given that this control is aimed to lead to the balance of powers, that is, to prevent unipolarism, to prevent a country from becoming too powerful. This also works in such a way that it prevents wars, and it prevents conflict. Because if countries can act to stop each other, if countries have an incentive to give concessions to each other, if countries have an incentive to communicate in such a way, to become interdependent or whatever in order to stop conflicts, although this is a cross-element within the liberal theory, but I think it can apply here as well, then it means that there are also incentives that stop wars. So, regardless of the fact there is a security dilemma, the existence of the balance of powers acts as a counteract to war. And lastly, about realism, I think that in certain cases, the security dilemma in and of itself can be portrayed as being a deterrent for war. Because the Cold War was the greatest arms race in the history of humankind, like nuclear weapons and all of that stuff. But it was also probably, despite the fears at that time, with the benefit of hindsight, the time of human history when war was least likely to break out. Because the security dilemma means that all countries want to create greater and greater amounts of like offensive and defensive capabilities, because they can never know when they're going to be invaded. If everyone thinks this, there comes a point where we cross a threshold where our military power is so strong and their military power is so strong that nobody has the interest to go to war. And that's what you can generally say about nuclear power and nuclear weapons debates.
Mutually assured destruction.
Mutually assured destruction, yes. Because if we nuke Russia and Russia nukes the US, not only do both Russia and the US crumble to the ground, but Europe is also caught in the crossfire and all the things go to hell. Like the atomic bombs we have today are several hundred, if not 1,000 times more powerful than the ones that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That, combined with the fact that we remember what happened to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's like the collective memory of the entire world that we commemorate it, means that countries that have nuclear weapons are never likely to go to war with each other, and that you are not likely to go to war with a country that has nuclear weapons. So that's a way in which a security dilemma can also act as a deterrent for war. In this particular situation, countries are more incentivized, and I think this is very useful for like Middle East debates or Africa debates or whatever. If the United States wants to measure dicks with Russia, they're more likely to go to a proxy war. They're more likely to fund certain rebels in Syria who are going to fight against other rebels in Syria who are funded by Russia, rather than go to direct war with each other. Because going to direct war with each other and like abandoning the facade of diplomacy and peace would essentially mean that everything goes to hell. I think that's a generally useful context for contemporary international relations. Maybe we should start moving on to liberal theory?
Sure, I'll just add two quick notes. One of them on just referring to what Tim just said. Another thing that's key to remember generally about analyzing international relations and dynamics in them is the question of how many great powers you have in the system. Like during the Cold War, one thing that was really good was the fact that there was nuclear weapons just made conflict irrational for anyone to engage in. The other thing that was very helpful to maintain, to sustain this so stable, was the fact that there were just two of them. So there were two powers. They had a direct phone line between them, the president of the US and the president of the Soviet Union. So they established very clear rules on what to do and what not to do. So for example, only having proxy wars, not escalating conflicts, and so on. When you have several great powers, let's say a world where you have like Europe before World War I, where you have the UK, you have France, you have Russia, you have Germany, you have Austria-Hungary, Hungary, that's already a very different system. It's much easier to miscalculate, it's much easier to get stuff wrong, it's much harder to coordinate between all these different things. Generally speaking, a multipolar system is significantly less stable than a bipolar system. And there's a big question about unipolar systems, like one where you have one superpower, such as, for example, the US during the 1990s. On the one hand, you cannot have a war between great powers, because there is just one. On the other hand, that great power could potentially do a lot of things on its own initiative, because nobody can stop it. So, for example, attacks in Yugoslavia during the 90s by the US or NATO forces, for example, the Iraq War in 2003, situations where one country does its own thing regardless of what other countries would like to happen. Just in conclusion about things to take and how we can use realism for analysis and debates, it's mostly the notion of what states care about. Like Tim was saying before about what the interests are and how to analyze incentives. So I think it's very, very useful just to think in terms of realism. You would say what we care about, what states care about, is security. What states care about are things that enhance their security. Things like perceptions or what people will say or public perceptions are only important if they have a clear and direct impact on my security and on my ability to survive. But things like military alliances, armies, strategically important positions are much, much more important than, for example, someone condemning me in the US, in the UN, or things of that sort. And these two are the things that actually motivate countries to do the things they do. Like it's not statements they've made, it's not treaties they've signed, but it's hard considerations of power and interest. And that is, I think, sometimes can be a very useful concept for you to use in certain debates when you're trying to portray that perspective in how countries behave. Now, as Tim said, moving on to liberalism. Basically, liberalism is an approach in international relations that says we accept a lot of the things realism says, but there are important caveats. And I'll discuss one of these caveats, and then Tim, I guess, will discuss others. So one is the idea of that I guess you're at least to an extent familiar with, which is called economic peace theory. And what this means is when countries become more, when countries have more trade with each other, a few really important things happen. One, if you think about it, wars are often used, like the potential benefit I can gain from war is to take over land, to take over resources of another country. If I have a free trade agreement with that country, and I get that stuff that they're selling me in the same way that I would get them if they're produced in my country, it makes no sense to go to war for them, right? Because let's say I really want the oil that another country is producing. If I take over that country, I would be fighting a war that costs me a lot, that is dangerous, that I could potentially lose. I would also then, when I get the oil, it's not like I'm going to just, give it out for free. I'll need my own company and my own infrastructure to extract that oil from the ground. I would need to sell it. At the end of the day, I would be selling it for pretty much, or I would be getting it for pretty much the same price I would from that country if I'm trading freely with them. So in that sense, going to war over that oil makes no sense anymore, right? Does that make sense? Yeah, so that's one thing. The other thing is, when I have very strong economic dependence on another country, like interdependence with other countries, then if they are damaged, I am damaged as well. So if lots of my pensions, the pensions of people in my country, are held in government bonds of my neighboring country, or in their big energy company, then if I go to war with that country, people in my country lose their pensions. That is a big disincentive for me to want to do that. Or companies in my country that export to that country might go bankrupt because they've lost their biggest market. I'm losing parts of my GDP. Like my economy literally suffers significantly from that. So that's a big, so on the one hand, I could get these things just as cheaply by trading, and my economy suffers a lot of harms from going to war with them. And that is a good reason why I would have significantly less of an incentive to go to war. Besides that, part of having economic collaboration is also that I have more people crossing the border, more people traveling, more people coming to visit from one country to the other, having personal connections. That makes it much harder to demonize that person, that other country, and say they're evil, they're against us. Well, people like your own country says, no, like they're cooperating with us, I'm buying from them, I'm saying I know their kids, like you have much more intimate familiarity with that other country. So all these things just mean that the more dependence you have between, the more interdependence you create between countries, the less likely they are to actually be hostile to each other. And basically, if you think about the European Union, the way it started was a community that managed steel and coal together, like jointly managing two resources, steel and coal. Occasionally, these are, like incidentally, these are the two resources you need to wage war. Because you need coal to, at the time you needed coal to power factories and war machines, and you need steel to build weapons and to build tanks. When you're using those resources jointly, you just cannot use them to go to war, right? To go to war with that other country that these sources are managed with. So if another country sells you weapons, you can't really go to war with that country that sells you weapons. So the reason this idea is very, very useful for debate is basically, first of all, what it means for international trade. Every motion about international trade, expanding trade deals, has a very strong political implication. Because it means better political relations between these countries, more security, less distrust. Secondly, it's a very good argument against sanctions. Because many debates are about like whether we should sanction a specific country. When you're doing sanctions, you're basically doing the opposite of that. You are intentionally closing off the ties between two economies, and therefore having less of an ability to influence, to create that interdependence, to create that trust. So I think that's a very useful concept to have in mind that can be useful in many, many debates.
Yeah. Moving on. As you could have seen, liberalism is very focused on proving structural reasons that if they are fulfilled are going to prevent countries from going to war, and this is what we should strive towards. Another one of these is the democratic peace theory, which developed by Michael Moore. So in the same way as Ayal mentioned, economic interdependence makes countries less likely to go to war. This theory posits that democracies are very unlikely to go to war against each other, or to go to war in general, but especially against each other. Because there's a number of structural limitations that democracy imposes on the ability of governments to decide to go to war. Number one is that people get to vote. And nobody would rationally decide to go to war. Because war means potentially that your country is going to get bombed, that buildings are going to get destroyed, or jobs are going to be lost. It means that you or your son or your friend may get drafted into the army and have to go somewhere else to a distant battlefield and die, or even your hometown may be invaded. Many countries even have like memories of wars. We as like a human race, we have collective memory of things like World War I, World War II. If you give people the choice, they are not very likely to choose the possibility of death. And this instantly limits the possibility of governments to act in this way. Because even if they manipulate the people into thinking that they're not going to go to war, and then they go to war anyway, governments get to be punished at the next elections. And governments know, given that their interest is to be re-elected, that if they lead people into ruin and death, they will probably be shamed, be damned, and lose the next elections. Another way in which this creates constraints is simply the possibility of parliamentary debate. So governments, unlike dictators, in democratic countries, cannot make unilateral decisions about going to war. Because you have to have a parliamentary procedure, you have to have different parties, you have to have votes in parliament. This procedure, because it is long and because it allows for a time span during which we can find diplomatic solutions or during which international institutions can step in and mediate, and because it's very hard that you're going to have bipartisan support for a war, for the same reason that I mentioned before, it's very hard the idea of war is going to pass through the parliamentary procedure. The third reason is because, as the theory goes, democracy creates and internalizes certain norms. Among these norms are the idea of equal human rights, the idea that everyone should have the possibility to self-manage, to control their own country and control their own destiny. The theory says that the individuals who are educated within the framework of democracy, who internalize democracy as the best system of government in the world, and who therefore also believe in these values, because through the educational system, through their parents, through the media, they are taught and they internalize that these values of equality and democracy and freedom are the most important. They are principally very likely to object to the idea of war and to object to the idea of intervening into somebody else's affairs, which not only affects the calculus of the people as voters, but also affects the politicians who supposedly are also brought in this same mindset and are less likely to want to wage war for various principal reasons. However, you will note that the economic peace theory and democratic peace theory also are not exclusively descriptive, like political realism, which simply says this is the way the world works. We describe how international relations need to interplay within countries. The liberal theory is also normative in the sense that it gives us a prescription of what we should strive towards in order to stop war. So the presumption is we should strive towards more economic interdependence, we should strive towards more economic liberalism, and we should strive towards more democracy. And that is one of the arguments as to why interventions are justified. Because, on a practical level, if we want to stop war in the long term, we need to have a world that is exclusively made out of countries which are liberal democracies, which have structural limitations that are going to mean that you're not going to go to war. This theory harkens back to Immanuel Kant and his treatises on eternal peace, where he said that we should have a world federation of liberal countries, of republican countries, by which he essentially meant a world made out of countries in which the people govern themselves because people are unlikely to go to war. So the argument goes, we are ready and prepared to sacrifice certain things now and go to war now, although it leads to people dying, although it leads to all the bad consequences of war, deposing a dictatorial regime, deposing an autocracy, and giving them the conditions to establish a stable democracy will prevent more death and more ruin in the long term because we will have less war. You will notice that the operation in Iraq was literally called Operation Iraqi Freedom. That is the normative implication. We go there, we establish democratic institutions, and we give them freedom to govern themselves. And when they govern themselves, they will never decide to elect another Saddam Hussein who is going to go to war. Rather, they're more likely, because of all the rationales of the economic peace theory, they're more likely to pursue interdependence, they're more likely to pursue trade, and they're not going to vote for their own death. There is also another normative way in which liberal theory advocates or can justify interventions. And that is that it is connected to the political theory of liberalism in some ways. And that is that, like, the political ideology of liberalism will say that the greatest value of any human being is freedom. And there are two, philosophical ways in which we can prove this. One is if you ask any person to decide completely willingly whether they want to be a slave or not, nobody will choose to be a slave. So you only choose to be a slave, you would very rarely choose to be a slave, but probably there are situations where you are, so poor and so downtrodden that if somebody would offer you a home in exchange for your slavery, you would probably accept. But most often you become a slave because you're forced to and because you're in chain. Nobody, of their free will, if there are not external conditions that would force you to do so, would choose to be a slave. That's what's one proof. The other is, we have literally seen people give their lives up for freedom. And not just in the sense, I will go to war and risk my life for the possibility that I will survive and live to see this freedom. We have seen people knowingly go to their deaths for the freedom of future generations. So if that is true, if people are willing to risk their life, and by losing your life you lose everything, and if you know that you will lose it, and the only reason why you are doing that is because you principally believe in the value of freedom, if not for yourself and for others, then obviously what you are willing to risk your life for is the greatest possible value. And that is freedom. At that point, a normative justification of interventions is freedom is the greatest possible value we can have. And therefore, if some people do not have it, we have a principal duty to help them achieve it. And that is where the contemporary concept of responsibility to protect comes from. And it's a relatively modern concept. It was formulated after a number of failed interventions, Rwanda, Bosnia, and so on and so forth. And essentially goes along the lines of, if a state is either unwilling to protect its citizens, then it is the responsibility of countries which are able to do so instead of that state to take action. So if there is a genocide in Rwanda, and the government is either unable or unwilling to stop that genocide from happening, it is the responsibility of international institutions, of the great powers of the world, to step in and to save the people of Rwanda. Because we believe that their liberty is a principle which is not confined only to the borders of that state. Their rights are universal. And the only way for their rights to be universal is for these rights to be universally protected. And at the point in which a state goes against that principle, we are perfectly fine with punishing that state. Because if a state attacks the highest possible value in human life, then that state has broken the principles of international community, and it is analogous to people breaking the law in national framework. So I cannot detain you against your will. I cannot handcuff you to a table and just leave you sitting here. But if you break the law, then the police has the right to handcuff you. Then the police has the right to use force against you if you are resisting. Then the police has the right to put you in jail. Because you have broken some fundamental principles, you have done harm upon others which we believe cannot be justified, and therefore you should be punished. The same principle, liberalism would say, goes in international relations. If you have broken the principles of individual freedom, if you have broken human rights, we have the right to use force against you because you have done harm to other people which in no way can be justified, and therefore our use of force is justified. Another analogy for this is, if you see someone being beaten up in an alleyway, so if someone is being beaten up in an alleyway, that person has the right to use self-defense and to defend against their attacker. But if that person is too weak, if either a small child is being beaten up by a huge man, and they do not have the power to defend themselves, you not only have the right to intervene, and would not be punished if you intervene, but in some legal systems, you have the legal duty to intervene. In some legal systems, you would be punished for negligence if you fail to protect another person in a situation where you plausibly could have without risking your life, of course, and you did not do so. If we believe that is true for individual people, if we believe that you are both legitimate in and sometimes obliged to help others when they cannot help themselves, then the same should be true for states. A state or a people within a state has the right to self-defense against an aggressor. But if they cannot use self-defense, and if we can plausibly help them, then it is our duty to ensure their defense because they cannot do so themselves. And I think these are helpful analogies for motions where we have to prop for interventions. Literally give analogies where we allow the same principle in an individual person-to-person framework and explain why we do so. And be very free to say, okay, here's why this is analogous. And if the other side wants to oppose this, they also have to oppose this number of other things which you probably are not going to oppose. And this is a useful justification if somebody wants to principally attack some idea of intervening somewhere or anything else. That would be my pitch on liberal theory. Do you have anything to add?
I'm inspired now to go and invade Iraq. I think that was a very I think this was a very good summation on a different area of this as well, of how do we justify certain actions because some debates in international relations are more about principles and what should we strive for, and usually it will be some sort of on the one hand this idea of universal values, and on the other hand the issue of sovereignty. Each country has control of its own territory, each country has control of its own, it should have absolute control of its own people. So Tim gave the good pitch for universal values. I'll just give the counter of that on why sovereignty is a value we might care about in international relations. So a few things. One, if states do not accept other states' integrity, the idea that another state has its own rights and should be able to control itself, what you get is a much more significant justification for wars generally, because just in the same way that liberals might say the most important thing is freedom, religious regimes might say the most important thing is serving God. And if we are helping that other nation serve God in a better way, that would be a legitimate reason for us to intervene in their affairs. For example, Iran invading its neighbors or something of that sort. And in the same way, a communist regime might say, we are promoting equality, we are promoting the end result of that all humanity is striving towards, and therefore it is legitimate for us to intervene in other countries as well. So, and the thing is, borders, if you think about them, don't have an existence unless countries believe them to have it, unless countries recognize each other's sovereignty to at least an extent. Borders, currencies, all these different things that countries operate would cease to exist at the point where countries don't recognize this principle that says each country should have control of its own citizens, of its own people, of its own territory. So that's one reason why, is a counter to that notion of interventionism. You could say maintaining sovereignty is really, really important. Another way of doing it would be the right of people to self-govern, to self-manage. Like, different cultures, different people have different conceptions of what they would like their country to look like, of what they want their life to look like. Sometimes that can even be a non-democratic view. Like, maybe it is better some people literally believe that that it's a better system for them to have, for example, if we take East Asia, to have lots of economic welfare without political representation, like China, like Singapore, countries of that sort. And that can be a legitimate trade-off for people to make. So basically, when we have each country able to maintain its own laws and its own principles, its own values, we just get more of an ability for more people to express and to live life the way they would want to. Because sometimes our notions of what people actually want are different from what these people themselves would like to have. So that just is a sort of counter or defense of sovereignty as a principle. So I think we have one concept left in how international relations works, which is constructivism. And as you can hear by the name, that's quite a complex theory. But basically, I think it will begin with the question of what is a state? Like, if we were discussing, if this was a carpentry lesson, and we were talking about tables, I would show you this table. I would say, this is the table, it's made of wood, it has this legs made of metal, this is the shape it has, and we can all see and know what we're talking about. What is a state?
What is a
state? Country.
State. That is a location where some people live and have their borders, which they preserve. And
yeah.
It's a state. Or do you mean state like?
Yeah, no. I mean that. I exactly mean state, like you said.
Yeah.
But the thing is, I cannot show you a state. I can't point and say. I can point to a map, but that map won't actually be like the physical thing that is a state. Yeah.
State is actually a concept which involves borders, people,
exactly.
Constitution, and
exactly. It's a concept. It's a concept. Exactly what it was getting at. A state is an idea, essentially. Like, if tomorrow morning everyone in the Balkan region woke up and lost their memory, they don't remember that states ever existed. States at that point would no longer exist. Like, at the point where politicians forget that they're supposed to come to parliament to make decisions, and soldiers forget they're supposed to wake up in the morning, take on their uniform, and go to the border to protect it, and people forget that these things, these strange paper things with dead people's images on them are money that can be used to buy things in stores. When they forget all these things, states cease to exist. And the reason that's an interesting concept to think about is states and relations between states are basically a common understanding that we have. Like, we all think that states exist because we all think they exist, and they behave in certain ways because we all believe they behave in certain ways. It's a bit of a mindfuck, and it might sound a bit like, this spiritualism, New Age stuff, but that's basically what it is. Like, it's a common idea that we have. And what constructivism says is basically that idea can change. the ideas of what countries are like and what countries behave like can change drastically over time. If you go to leaders to the president of Chancellor of Germany today and you ask, are you worried about the potential of a French invasion? They would look at you like you're insane. If you asked that 90 years ago, yes, that was the main concern on the table, like being afraid of war with France. Nowadays, it's inconceivable. Like when Britain is discussing Brexit, they are very pissed off with the EU right now. They're in a problematic situation, they're in chaos, they're in turmoil. I can assure you that at no point in these discussions did anyone come up and say, let's invade Belgium. At no point did they say this, although they have nuclear weapons, they have a very strong navy, they have, probably they could overpower Belgium quite easily, take over Brussels, and make sure the Brexit negotiation goes to their favor. But this is inconceivable, because ideas of what international realities are like have changed drastically since 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And basically, something like the European Union is based on these norms, these values, and ideas changing. So, funnily enough, what constructivists would say is realism, for example, is a self-fulfilling prophecy. The reason states behave in this way is not necessarily that all the rational calculus that we just mentioned, but the fact that statesmen have all gone through academies where they have learned international relations theory and learned about realism. And therefore playing it out when they become heads of state. So basically, to use that in terms of debating, the place where that sort of theory becomes relevant is when we're talking about if we said realism is a good way of prioritizing hard interests and hard power and strategy, constructivism is a very, very useful way to prioritize things like ideas and norms. And the way in which discourse shapes policies and shapes the way international realities work. Now this can work both ways, because you can create very good norms through changing discourse and changing leaders' minds and changing people's minds. You can also create very bad norms. Like you could also theoretically come back to an age of religious wars or an age of where executing leaders as part of a war is something that's completely fine, or where you can have, or we don't respect things like laws of war and prisoners of war and things like that, and war becomes much more brutal. So this is also something that could potentially result from countries behaving in a different way and thinking about international realities in a different way. And I think that's just something very useful to keep in mind for motions as well.
I think the last part of this, given we should wrap up in around 10 minutes, would be to wrap up constructivism. As a consequence of what Ayal said, that international relations are generally, within the constructivist perspective, decided by perceptions and constructions of how things are perceived. This also means that fabricating perceptions can be a strategy in international relations. So, for example, countries and governments very often go out of their way to create and construct the image of an enemy, of the other, as psychoanalytical theory would say. Very often you have demonization of certain countries, of certain peoples, because it suits the political interest of a certain group. For example, if you read the charter of Hamas, within the charter of Hamas it is stated that the state of Israel is the enemy of Hamas because it is a Jewish state, and that they will not stop until the law of Allah rules over that land. What is the implication of this? They are constructing the image of Israel as being an enemy, not just in a political sense, but in a metaphysical, religious sense. The way they exist, the fact that they exist, and the way they exist, means as long as they exist, they are our enemy and they should be fought against. The implication of this is there is no compromise. And then, if this is the perception that you report to the people through the media, if this is the way you educate people, if this is the way religious leaders who are extremely respected and trusted and political leaders speak, then this is the perception that people are going to have. And this means that you have far more political capital to conduct, for example, aggressive policy towards Israel, if that's what you want to do. Because you have the people convinced of a certain image of an enemy or an image of a country. A lot of things in the United States during the Cold War was justified via the fear of communism. So the entire policy of McCarthyism at the end of the 40s and beginning of the 50s, where literally United States public officials and like congressmen were purged and lost their jobs because of supposed connections to the Soviet state, which were never proven. The reason why this could have been done is because at that time, people feared the red threat. They feared that the Soviet Union might start spreading a global agenda of communism. This fear was most radically seen during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And because they feared that, they believed it was legitimate to purge people who we could suspect of collaborating, including with Russia. Something like that could not happen today. If it were to happen today, it would be an international scandal of epic proportions. Like people literally losing their jobs or being threatened with violence because like they utilize their free speech. But at that time, because of a perception that was constructed by certain officials within the US government, those things worked. I think that this kind of demonization, this kind of language, you very often find in places of ethnic tension where war crimes were committed. I mean, these are horrible stories. But if you take a look at the way Rwandan media reported in the Rwandan genocide, how the Hutus portrayed the Tutsis, and the word that they used, they would say the Tutsis are vermin which have to be exterminated. And why do they use these words? Why specifically these words? Because vermin is A, an animal, and B, it brings absolutely no use. It's not even a useful animal. So the purpose at that point is to dehumanize, to create the perception these people are less than human. Therefore, we are legitimate